Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Happy New Year, and welcome to another season of Brave New World. My guest today is Michael Levin, who's a professor of biology at Tufts University. Michael studies cognition and intelligence using a unique blend of concepts and methods from biology, neuroscience, computer science, and philosophy. It makes for some fascinating reading that relates what's going on in biology at the level of the cell to properties of organisms and AI and even consciousness. Michael, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, and nice to meet you. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get started, just tell us a little bit about yourself, Michael. Like what influenced you growing up, and how did you end up studying what you're studying, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, well, the short version is that as a pretty young kid, I was always interested in engineering, in particular electrical kinds of things, electronics. I would take things apart, and at the same time, I spent a lot of time outside looking at bugs and insects and eggs and caterpillars and whatnot, and always interested in complexity, in agency, and the difference between engineering artifacts that we make and the kinds of things that exist in the natural world. Asking, where do preferences come from? Where do, how intelligence is embodied? Those kinds of things. So I had that interest from a very early age. I went to undergraduate initially to study computer science. And I wanted to work in AI, and I got 2 BS degrees, one in biology and one in computer science. After that, I went to grad school and I got a PhD in genetics. And then a postdoc, and now I run a lab at Tufts University and the Allen Discovery Center, where we address all of the things around embodied intelligence in very unconventional kinds of ways. I also have a faculty appointment at the Wyss Institute at Harvard, where we do a lot of bioengineering as well.
So that's a sort of an unusual path, right? I mean, you've sort of been immersed in biology and computing. That's unusual. I mean, it's exactly the right space to be in at the moment. What sort of led you towards the biology side of things, right? You said you were interested in AI. What led you towards biology?
Well, at first, and it's funny, and nowadays I think everybody understands that these kinds of interdisciplinary things are great, and that biology and computation work together nicely. Back in the day when I was trying to make the switch from computer science to biology, it was much harder. It did not seem to a lot of people that this was a good idea at all. There was a lot of resistance to it, actually, when I went to grad school and things like that. But what led me to it was simply the realization that we did not know what we needed to know in order to make real artificial intelligence. We just didn't have the tools, and yet under every rock there are eggs of various insects and worms and so on, and these are incredibly complex self-assembling systems that make the complete journey from matter to mind. So you have there a little oocyte, a bunch of biochemicals sitting there quiescently, and that system self-assembles into a creature with goals, preferences, problem-solving capacities, self-driven behavior and inner perspective. And it became clear to me that developmental biology was the way to understand what I really wanted to understand, which is how mind becomes embodied in living matter. That before we could build such things, we really needed to understand the one example of it that we have right in front of us.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking that it's really sort of important to have the tools and the instruments to be able to study this kind of phenomenon, right? I mean, at one point, we just didn't have the tools to study it. When I got into AI, late 70s, early 80s, I was influenced by Herb Simon, who, had this sort of model of cognition as consisting of, long-term memory, short-term memory, and there was a mechanism that sort of, evoked the two and, made things happen, right? I mean, that was sort of a abstract model of computation that was, a fairly big part of AI at the time. And we just didn't have the tools to study the brain and biology like we do now. So a lot of it is just, I guess, being in the right place at the right time and sort of knowing when a discipline is right to go into because the instrumentation's been developed sufficiently.
Yeah, that's part of it. Certainly, the instrumentation is critical, but also it's conceptually it's really important because, for example, I think that the focus on the brain, while in some ways obvious, but in other ways I think is really misleading in this whole effort to understand intelligence more broadly. I mean, obviously, brains do interesting things that are unique, but can get into it here if you want. But I actually think that intelligence is way older than brains. It's extremely basal systems have it, and that in order to really understand what's going on and to recognize unconventional minds around us and to build new minds and to relate to them ethically, we need to loosen our hyperfocus on the brain and the nervous system. And so part of it is having the tools, the experimental tools, but part of it is having a conceptual framework that allows you to ask broader questions. And I think some of the classic developmental biologists, many of whom were sort of sidelined in some ways once molecular biology got started and so on, actually were onto this idea and understanding that the self-construction of the body and the self-construction of the mind are really the same problem in a fundamental sense. Turing, by the way, being one of them, I think Turing had this insight, although he didn't explicitly talk much about this.
So let's get deeper into this, right? The essence of your theory. And, I became sort of familiar with your work relatively recently when I read something about confabulation, right? That memory isn't this sort of passive thing there that's corded, in some objective sense, but we actually, confabulate. That memory seems to be an active process, which I thought was interesting. And on the one hand, we all know that, right? We know that we sort of make things up, or we can bring different perspectives on a situation, but I've been in AI for a long time, and I never sort of seriously thought about memory as anything but sort of objective. It's recorded, and then we retrieve it, and we may retrieve it, not faithfully. We may sort of make things up along the way, but memory itself is solid. It was recorded in some way. And when I read your work, it was like, it sort of questions that and demonstrates that perhaps isn't the case, and that memory just seems to be something else altogether. And so that really got me thinking about the larger implications of it in the legal system, in justice, like all kinds of things, right? Where we sort of assume that there's some sort of underlying truth, right? And your theory seems to sort of throw that into question. So let's just go back. I mean, how would you sort of summarize your thinking and a theory? Pretending that we're at a cocktail party and we've just met, and I'm asking you what you do. How would you describe that to regular people like myself?
Sure. Well, okay. I mean, and the memory thing is just it's one sort of slice of what we do, but let's just focus on that for a moment. I should say that from the perspective of neuroscience, this is in no way a new theory, in the sense that people have known for a long time now that memories are labile, that recall is not non-destructive, that you cannot simply recall memories without changing them. And also in neuroscience, there's a ongoing controversy about what the substrate of memory actually is, because the synapses are incredibly dynamic kinds of structures. So some of this already exists in neuroscience, but I draw a much wider parallel here to developmental and evolutionary biology in a way that does suggest some very different ways to do computing. And the thing that was sort of nailed down in Turing's formulation is a very sharp distinction between data and machine. So you have this machine and it operates on passive data. And that's something that we'll come back to towards the end of what I'm about to say, because I'd like to blow up that distinction as well. So the idea here is that you have a machine that's going to act on this passive data, and the data is reliable. In other words, the tape is reliable, in the sense that most of our computing architectures are committed to the stability and the fidelity of the data. You have these layers of abstraction where if you're operating at a certain level, you don't need to worry about the metal underneath. You don't need to worry about, your bus changing shape or the number of transistors changing or bits of, just suddenly degrading. And I mean, of course, there's unreliable computing and things like that. But typically the whole point of it is to shield all that stuff from the higher levels so that you can program at a level of abstraction where you don't need to really worry about how it's done underneath. Biology takes the exact opposite approach, and this is why I think it's interesting for both sides. What happens in biology is that from the start that your substrate is unreliable. Proteins are going to come and go. Molecules are going to come and go. You never quite know how many of anything you have. There will be damage. There will be mutations. The environment will be different. You will be different. Evolution faces a dilemma in that if you're a species that doesn't change, you will surely die out when other things change. But if you do change, you are no longer yourself. So again, you're gone. And so this ancient philosophical kind of question about how do I persist and yet learn and change and adapt is this idea that what biology optimizes is not for fidelity and keeping something the same. It optimizes salience. It optimizes for meaning. And I'll talk about what that is. So let's just go back to actual memory for a second. So as a living being, whether you're a human or anything else, you don't have access to your past. What you have access to is some engrams that have been left in your body in some biophysical medium. Maybe it's synaptic plasticity. Maybe it's RNA, as Glanzman says. It could be many things. I actually think it's many things. What you have...
Just on that. So when you say it's engrams, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I certainly didn't come up with the notion of engrams. It's very old. The idea of an engram is simply some biophysical change in your body that is left over from a prior experience. So in order for you to have memory, whether that's RAM or anything else, or some kind of biological substrate, something has happened. Maybe it was some kind of training. Maybe it was associative conditioning. Whatever it was, that memory has to leave a trace in your brain or in your body somewhere. There's something biophysically. There's a medium. There's a memory medium. In RAM, you might have flipped a flip-flop state or whatever it is. But somewhere there has to be a physical change. And so at any given time, at this now moment, you and I have to reconstruct dynamically on the fly a story of who we are, what we're doing from the engrams that we have. Because again, you don't have access to the past. You have access to the history, to the traces that the past has left in your body and in your brain. Now, this means that one way to think about it as memories as messages from your past self. What you really have are a bunch of messages in some medium that have been left for you by the actions of your past self. And you must now construct on the fly a story about a model of the world, a model of yourself, and continuously manage that story adaptively to make it fit current circumstances. Now, there's a couple of interesting things there. First, in any good kind of learning creates very compressed engrams, meaning you don't record every pixel you've ever seen. What you record are compressed kinds of generalizations of, okay, I saw 1,000 particulars, and from this I infer a rule, and what I remember is the rule. And you throw away the correlations. That's how you get the compression, and you learn. And this is what we call, effective learning, is you didn't just overtrain on the particulars, you actually inferred a pattern. And that means that what you get in these engrams is not the exact details of what happened. You get a compressed representation that then has to be reinflated. So think about an autoencoder where you've got all this large stuff coming in. You've got a tight node in the middle. It's like a bow tie node in the middle. That is your compressed representation. So the left part of the bow tie is your learning and your generalization. The right part is creative interpretation, because having thrown away a bunch of details, in order for you to take those lessons and apply them to your current scenario, you would have to interpret them. And that interpretation is not it's not deductive. You can't just, algorithmically know exactly what it means. You don't know what it means. You have to apply some degree of creativity. And I'll give you an extreme example, which is in humans, it's less extreme, but here's a biological example. Imagine the butterfly, the caterpillar to butterfly transition. Okay, it's now known that if you are a caterpillar and we train you to find leaves to eat given a certain color stimulus, that caterpillar will then become a moth or a butterfly that still remembers the original information. Now, there's two wild things about that. One, the less amazing thing, which is amazing enough, but the less amazing thing is that during that process, the brain is basically refactored. So most of the cells die, all the connections are broken. You get a completely different brain rebuilt because now instead of a soft-bodied robot that moves in two-dimensional space, you need a controller that runs a hard-bodied thing that flies in 3D space. Okay, so the fact that the memories survive brain refactoring is, of course, amazing and something that none of our computational media can really do. But here's the more amazing fact. Notice that the actual raw memories of the caterpillar are of absolutely no use to the butterfly because knowing how to crawl to leaves is not something that the butterfly can use. It doesn't want leaves. It drinks nectar, and it doesn't crawl, it flies. So what has to happen to that information is not merely the fidelity. It's not the design challenge isn't how do I keep the information even though my brain is going to be completely refactored. It's how do I remap the information onto a totally new body. What the butterfly inherits from its former life is not the exact memories. It inherits some sort of a general lessons that can be remapped onto a new body and onto a new structure. So I think that's kind of an extreme example, but we are all to some extent in that boat because all of us inherit these messages from our past, and we know from neuroscience that our brains are incredibly good at concocting reasonable stories given various forms of evidence, including your own memories. And those stories are not tied necessarily to fidelity of what actually happened. They're tied to current adaptive value. They're tied to what is the best story I can tell right now.
I found that really fascinating, the example of caterpillar to the butterfly. The other example I found really fascinating in reading your work was this example you cite about, when a odorant molecule is injected into a frog egg, the subject actually seeks out that smell in its search for food. And, I've been studying smell for the last couple of years. And that just sort of got my attention. I was like, well, how the hell is that happening? Right? I mean, do you have a theory of like what's happening when you inject an odor into a frog egg and it sort of looks for that in its food subsequently?
I don't have a specific theory about what's happening in that individual case, but I think it is an example of a much more general phenomenon, which is that in biology, information always travels massively across scales. So just think about the following. When you, in the morning, you wake up and you have certain high-level social career goals, whatever. These are very high-level executive cognitive goals. In order for you to execute those goals, you have to get up out of bed, which means that your body has to transduce these very abstract cognitive kinds of things into the movement of potassium and calcium ions across cell membranes in your muscle. Your body is a machine for doing, mind to matter kinds of controls. It's remarkable that that kind of information propagates all of those levels. If I said to you that just with the power of my mind alone, I can make chemicals cross my cell membranes, you would either think I'm crazy or that this is some sort of very rare mind-body medicine, some sort of yoga, some kind of crazy, like unusual mind-body medicine. But actually, this is all day, every day is what your body is doing. This is completely conventional voluntary motion. It's the linkage between these very high level behavioral kinds of things and physical events that happen inside your cells. This is why hypnodermatology works. This is why all kinds of placebo effect studies, as Benedetti says, words and drugs have the same mechanism of action. So the reason I bring all that up in the frog case is this. What's remarkable about that case is that you have a molecular event inside the cells of an embryo, which gets transduced into a behavioral cascade of a large-scale animal that is presumably run by the brain. So again, that information, it has to be analyzed by the cells. The compound that you're injecting has to be analyzed by the cells, and it has to make its way up. That information has to make its way to a completely different scale of description, which is behavior. And so I don't know exactly how it works in that case, but I think that's what we're looking at. I think all of this is about information bouncing across levels. And one last thing I want to add to the previous business about the memory is simply this. You can also think about how this works on a much larger scale with developmental information and evolution. Here's a simple example, and then I'll tell you how it fits to the whole memory thing you're asking about. If imagine you're a salamander, a newt, and we look at a cross section of the kidney tubule. It's a little tube that goes to the kidney. That tubule is normally made up of, let's say, 8 to 10 cells cooperating with each other to make this tube and leave a hole in the middle. Now, one thing you can do with these animals is you can create extra copies of the chromosomes, of the genetic material in the egg, and that makes the cells bigger. So if you do this, what you find is that the actual salamander is exactly the same size, but the tubules now in cross-section have, instead of 8 to 10 cells, they have 4 to 5 cells because the cells are bigger. What's even more amazing is that if you make the cells really gigantic, so now this is, I think, 6N newts, right? Newts that have many copies of their genetic material. The cells get so big that only one cell will fit around that tubule. What does it do? It bends around itself, leaving a hole in the middle. So this is a completely different molecular mechanism. Instead of cell-to-cell communication, now you've got cytoskeletal bending of some sort. So think about what this means. You're a newt coming into the world. You cannot assume that what can you count on? Well, you can't count on knowing how much DNA you're going to have. You can't count on the size or the number of your cells. You have to have an algorithm that can make something coherent, ideally a newt, even if your own parts change. Never mind the environment's going to change, but your own parts are going to change. And so, and I could tell you some amazing examples. This is in Planaria. This really went all the way to the end with an algorithm that just basically completely ignores a very junky hardware. What happens there is that I think biology leaned in from the earliest moments to the idea that the hardware is not to be trusted, and that the information that you have from past generations is a suggestion. It's a message. It is not any kind of a plan to create a specific machine. It is data that you should be able to interpret in whatever way makes sense at the moment, knowing that everything will be different. I think living things do not overtrain on their evolutionary priors. What evolution makes are problem-solving machines, and that kind of goes back to this issue of memories as messages that you are now free to interpret. And this is why I think we've been thinking in my group about a new computational platform that is built around this idea, not the fidelity of information, but the saliency and the on-the-fly interpretation.
That is absolutely fascinating. So I wondered why those are sort of competing objectives, the salience versus fidelity, and whether they're competing because of limited capacity or something else. Because I was thinking, you talk about sort of this persistence paradox where, our cells change, we are physically different today than we were yesterday and a lot different in a year from now. And yet these memories seem to persist. I write a newsletter that accompanies this podcast, and a previous newsletter called Fuck Shakespeare, excuse the French, where I recited a story where the punchline was Fuck Shakespeare. And I've told that story so many times, because it's just hilarious. And I wonder whether I tell it the same way every time, but the essence of it is the same. I don't remember the details. The essence of it is the same. But I guess what I'm getting at is that, I can buy that I stored some compressed version of that episode in my head, and because that episode was so interesting and relevant, I remember a lot of the details of it. But I guess I could also take the view that my recording of that episode was, imperfect because I'm limited cognitively. I've got a limited amount of memory, a limited attention. But that, some people would have recorded that thing in a lot more fidelity than others. So I guess what I'm saying is that maybe some of us are just blessed with better memories than others because we've got better hardware. And so we have higher fidelity as well than others. Some people can't remember anything. And so I wonder why those are competing.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're not mutually exclusive. Both are important, but the thing about the salience is that it's much broader than human memory and recall of episodic events. I mean, let's go back to the Newt story. You coming into the world, you have no idea what your embodiment is going to be like. Now maybe it's the same as it always has been, but the reason that this incredible plasticity exists is because most creatures, and there are some exceptions. I mean, I think nematodes actually might be an exception to this, but most creatures are, a kind of a colloquial way to say it is they have a kind of beginner's mind to it. And they come into the world and they have to build a self model and a world model from scratch. They cannot assume and that gives them incredible power. I'll give you another example. To address the origins of novelty and the plasticity and these kinds of things, we build some synthetic creatures that have never been here before. And the interesting thing about these synthetic creatures is that you can't use a long history of selection to explain their features. Okay, you have to ask why a perfectly standard set of cells, so the same hardware, can do something completely different than what it normally does. So we can take cells from the tracheal epithelium of an adult human, and under some pretty simple conditions, they reboot their multicellularity. They self-assemble into something we call an anthrobot. What's an anthrobot? It's a self-assembling little structure. It has only the tracheal epithelial cells. It has no neurons. It starts to move around. It swims around, and it has some pretty remarkable properties, including the ability to heal neural wounds that it comes across. Now, we're doing all kinds of work studying their memories and their preferences and all this kind of stuff. But the point is this: there has never been any anthrobots in evolution. Why is it that an 80-year-old patient's cells are perfectly happy to reconstruct a different body plan, a different kind of proto-organism, and have different kind of behaviors? This is, I think, what we're seeing is this really fundamental plasticity. It isn't that life doesn't want to store accurate information. Sometimes you need that, and that's fine. But you need to be ready to reinterpret and reuse your own hardware in new ways. And there are many examples that I go through in various papers where I show morphogenesis and the self-construction of bodies is not a hardwired process. It is not well explained by the emergence of complexity. It's a very popular paradigm like cellular automata and so on, where you have simple rules and then something complex emerges. Complexity is cheap. It's easy to have emergent complexity, but that isn't what biology is doing. It's not just emergent complexity. It's emergent cognition. These things are actually solving problems in anatomical space, in gene expression space, and physiological state space. All of these are problem-solving agents that are not following some rote set of rules. They have preferences. They have ways to meet the same goal by different means, by reusing the hardware at their disposal. And I think this was what most of evolution is about, is finding ways to construct these kind of problem-solving machines that index into the space of affordances given to us by the laws of physics, the laws of computation, mathematics, and so on, to be able to solve problems and construct something coherent that's going to have a life, even when absolutely everything around you is changing, including your own parts.
There's got to be some sort of higher level objective function just driving, even biology, right? So what would that be? Would that be just like preservation?
Yeah, so I can't give you a firm answer, but I'll give you some hypotheses. I don't think it's preservation, because if you stick with preservation, and I know that's the standard, neo-Darwinian story, is that the things that are most likely to be observed will be observed, and that's kind of that's a story of preservation. I don't think it's preservation, because everything about the frameworks that I just told you is about the idea that you cannot hope to remain the same. It's futile. You need to the only kind of preservation is the kind that leads you to change, to adaptive change. And so here are a couple of hypotheses. At first, I thought that what life was doing was problem solving. It was looking for solutions to a specific problem. I then thought that probably better than that would be what it's actually doing is looking for problems instead of looking for solutions to a specific problem. I think it's actually doing more than that. I think it's looking for problems that it can solve. But I actually think we can do even better than that. I think what it's really doing is looking to expand into new problem spaces in which there are new problems to which it will then eventually look for solutions. So just imagine.
Meaning what? Like what does that mean?
Yeah. So imagine you're a single cell, and all of your actions are around navigating physiological and transcriptional space. So the space of all possible gene expressions, the space of all possible physiological states. Your goal is to navigate that space adaptively. There are things going on that try to pull you out of a homeostatic attractor where life is good, and your job is to try to stay there. And so what you're doing is you're managing your navigation into that in that space. Your cognitive light cone, which is the size of the goals you can possibly pursue, is extremely small because all you care about is what's going on, meaning the set points, the things you are trying to manage are all very small, both in space and time. They're about the size of a single cell. So if you're a bacterium, the only thing you care about is your local concentration of various goodies. You've got maybe a memory going back 20 minutes, maybe predictive capacity going forward, maybe 5 minutes. That's it. You've got a very small cognitive light cone. And you're operating in physiological space, metabolic space, those kinds of things. Now imagine suddenly you acquire the ability to connect yourself to other cells that are like you. So one way to do that is through these electrical synapses known as gap junctions. So evolution discovers these gap junctions. Cells are now connected. When cells are directly connected through these gap junctions, they start sharing memories. It becomes a kind of mind meld because the memory molecules spread, and that means you can't tell your memory from my memory. So we now share. It's our memory. You have more computational capacity, and because you are now and there's a much longer story to be told, but the bottom line is that you now have the ability to store large goal states as memories that are about anatomical shape. So individual cells in your body don't know what a finger is or how many fingers you're supposed to have or anything like that. All they know is their own local goals that they can pursue. But a large cellular collective absolutely knows those things. And we know that's true because if you try to deviate it, so if you have an early embryo or in fact a salamander and you cut off some fingers or the whole limb, those cells will immediately recognize that they've been deviated and they will build back and they will stop when it's done, when the exact correct anatomy has been restored, because they have a memory of where in anatomical space they need to be. So what you've done in acquiring multicellularity is project yourself from the spaces you used to operate in, which is physiological and metabolic, into an entirely new space that individual cells couldn't have operated in, which is anatomical morphospace. So you do this, and you're in anatomical morphospace, and you solve all kinds of problems in making all kinds of amazing looking, plants and animals, and then eventually you discover muscle and nerve. And suddenly you're projecting yourself into three-dimensional space because now you can move and now you can run around and work towards goals in three-dimensional space. So now, because of this new kind of system, you're able to your brain is and your musculature is now able to project you through another kind of space. And then eventually your brain develops further, and now you're in linguistic space, and suddenly you can operate in a completely different space. So I think what life is really doing is the overall objective function, to the extent that there is any objective function. I mean, I think there's a problem with that framing to begin with, but to the extent that we can see something that looks like an objective function, what I think it's doing is trying to project itself into new spaces in which it can thrive.
Michael, you're completely blowing my mind. So yeah, I guess maybe objective function is putting it strongly, because maybe the purpose of life is just to. There is no purpose; it just exists. But as you were talking, I was reminded of this film called My Octopus Teacher. I don't know if you've seen it. It's by Pippa Ehrlich. She was a guest last year on this podcast. And there's the scene where the shark like tears off one of the octopus's limbs and it grows back, right? But so it seems like in some organisms it grows back, right? That the organism knows what it needs to do and it's done, but in others it doesn't. So what explains that, right? Because humans, you lose a limb, you can't grow it back.
I mean, not yet.
We're
working on it. I don't actually think that's fundamental. I think that's a temporary limitation that will be lifted. Okay. The more general point here is that if your cells didn't emerge into collectives that remember the overall pattern, we would not survive past about a month. In other words, material and cells are coming and going in your body all the time. And we are a ship of Theseus. The ship is in the memory of the replacement machinery, which is the other cells. And it is these pattern memories present in your body. They're stored in bioelectric states. They're stored in biochemical states, biomechanical states, and so on. If those memories were not there, we would not be able to resist disorder of degeneration, aging, cancer. It is working constantly to keep us going. Now, some animals like salamanders are very good at it. The champion of all this is the planaria, which are amazingly good at it, and we can talk about that. I think that's worth mentioning.
Say more about that when you say the champions. Why is that?
Well, okay, so let's talk about planaria. So planaria are they're a flatworm. They're not like earthworms. They are they're similar to our direct ancestor. They have a true brain, many of the same neurotransmitters that you and I have. Here are some amazing properties of planaria. First of all, you can chop them up into pieces. The record, I believe, is 276 pieces, and every piece will regenerate a complete, a perfect little worm, including brain and everything else. So they're incredibly resistant to large-scale injury. Number two, they are also incredibly resistant to small-scale injury, meaning they do not get cancer. So they are very cancer-resistant because they have this incredible control over their morphology. The third thing is that they're immortal. They do not age. So the asexual lines of these planaria have been around for, 400 million years. And during this time, they go on. There is no evidence of aging in these animals because they continuously replace according to their plan. Now, the last thing, which sounds like it is a paradox, and it drove me crazy for over 20 years, but I think we finally got a handle on what's going on. The last thing about planaria is this: they have a really junky genome. And what I mean by that is, just imagine when animals like you and I have children, the kids do not inherit the mutations in our bodies. Right? If you have a mutation in your arm, your kids don't inherit that because we set aside our germline and it comes from the egg and the sperm. Planaria, at least the asexual forms, are not like that. They tear themselves in half and then they regenerate. That's how they reproduce. So any mutation that doesn't kill the neoblast cell that's there will be propagated into the next generation as the thing has to recreate half the body, right? After it divides. So they accumulate. So for hundreds of millions of years, these things have been accumulating mutations. Their cells are what's called mixoploid, meaning they have different numbers of chromosomes. It's an incredible mess. And yet, I mean, does it not strike you as weird? And I certainly never heard this in any biology class that I ever took, that the animal with immortality, regeneration, cancer resistance is also the one with the worst genome. That doesn't sound right, yeah. But by the basic story that we've been all told, that the genome tells you what you are, and it's and the importance of of the fidelity of your genetic information is broken here. And so this drove me nuts for years, and I think we finally, through computational modeling and some research, I think figured out what's going on there.
So is there you talk about having a junky genome. I mean, does that mean that every individual has a different genome?
Basically,
is there like a single blueprint?
Well, first of all, the genome is in no case a blueprint of the body at all, ever. Yeah, there are tremendous differences between individual planaria because they accumulate mutations.
Why do you say the genome is not a blueprint for the body?
Absolutely not. This is a major misconception. If you look at the genome, what does the genome actually encode? The genome encodes proteins, and That's it. You cannot see directly in the genome anything about your body structure, your shape, how many eyes, do you have eyes? We have none of that is in there. What's in there is the description of the nano level hardware that every cell gets to have, the little signaling proteins. That's what's in the genome. Everything else that happens after that is the result of the physiological software playing out on top of this genetically determined hardware. So it's the equivalence to having a very good description of the germanium, the silicon, the copper, everything else in your computer. What you are not getting in the genome is the architecture and the capabilities of the software that's there.
And when you say the software, what do you mean? Is that the environment, or is that also part of the where's the software coming from?
Okay, I'll tell you what it is, and then we can tackle the much deeper question of where is it coming from, because that gets us into some philosophical waters. But let's talk about what I mean by the software. So we know that if your hardware has this property of being reprogrammable, it means that you cannot tell the full story of what it's doing or what it's going to do just by an account of the hardware alone. You have to be able to understand its dynamical properties. So in this case, imagine. In the planarian case, what the genome encodes is a bunch of ion channels. These ion channels are specific proteins that sit in the surface of the cell, and they let ions go back and forth. That's it. That's what the genome encodes. So now imagine, once you have a field of cells, so let's say an embryo with a bunch of these ion channels, they form an electrically excitable medium. Okay, and it's akin to a chemically excitable medium in which Turing patterns can be formed, and many other kinds of media. Now, the way that evolution has shaped these channels is that hardware by default will adopt through the laws of physics and computation that operate through this electrical medium. It will adopt by default a particular configuration. It's like when you order a calculator, from the factory, you turn it on. Every calculator starts out at 0. That's it. That's the default. That's what the electronics do. Now, the recipe for how to build a calculator doesn't say anything about 0. What it says is here: if you connect the transistors in a certain way, the default behavior will be this, because we know the laws of electricity, that's what it's going to do. So the default planarian, sort of out of the box planarian, has an electrical system that defaults to saying one head. It actually says many things, but let's just focus on head number. So by default, that electrical hardware settles into an attractor state. That circuit settles into an attractor state that says build one head. Now, the traditional story is, this is feed-forward emergence of complexity. So just like a Turing pattern, which is what Turing was actually onto when he was studying these patterns in chemically excitable media, he was interested in the origins of order, right? How bodies construct themselves, because I think he understood that this is basically a symmetry to how minds construct themselves. And what we know is that through symmetry breaking and understanding the laws of self-organization, you end up with a default pattern. And in this case, the pattern says one head. And that's the conventional story. Now, we looked at this and we said, well, some electrical circuits are reprogrammable in the sense that they have a memory. If you reset them to something else, they will keep, right? So like a flip-flop, you don't need to change out the hardware. You give it a different signal, and then it holds. So what we were able to do is, first, we developed the tools to visualize that electric circuit. And we said, how does it know to have one head? And we said, look, we can see it. Here's the electrical distribution. That means one head. So now let's rewrite it. Let's rewrite it to a form that says two heads. Well, guess what the cells build? If you do that, the cells will build a two-headed planarian. And furthermore, if you keep cutting that two-headed planarian, those pieces will in perpetuity continue to generate two-headed animals, because the circuit has now permanently been reset to two heads. And as far as that cellular collective is concerned, the memory of what a proper planarian should look like is now two-headed. Now, the reason I call it software is this. There is nothing genetically different about those animals. If I were to release them, I'm not going to, but if I were to release them into the Charles River here in Boston, 50 years from now, some scientists could come along, they would scoop up some samples, they would see some one-headed worms and some two-headed worms, and they would say, oh, cool, a speciation event. Let's sequence the genome and see what happened. And they would see absolutely nothing different in the genome. There's nothing different with the genome. That is not where the information is. So this is, to me, this is the mark of, and by the way, I am not claiming that our von Neumann architecture and our very narrow notions of programming are suitable for describing living systems. That's not what I'm saying. I think those things will have to be radically altered. But what's useful about the notion of software is that we have the exact same hardware, genetically encoded proteins, that is now able to support completely different visions of where they should go in anatomical space, to the one-headed attractor or the two-headed attractor. So the ability to reprogram this thing, not by rewiring, not by changing the hardware, not by changing the genome, not by moving around the connection between the physical parts, but by an experience, a physiological signal done at a very high level. We didn't have to say what genes to turn on and off to build ahead. There are thousands of genes that have to be activated. We didn't touch any of that. We are programming at a very high level here, and we are changing the memory that says how many heads you're supposed to have, and then the system does the rest. So those properties are exactly the kinds of things that we want to borrow from the computational paradigm of reprogramming, where you understand that your hardware is not the only level at which you can interact with the system. As I tell my students, this is why when you want to go from Photoshop to Microsoft Word, you don't get out your soldering iron and start rewiring. It's because we've understood in computer science that some hardware is reprogrammable in place, and biology is absolutely reprogrammable in place.
So it's fascinating. So the software is actually then being driven by the environment.
Yes and no. I mean, it's environment in the sense that we came along, and in this particular case that I've just described, we came along and we changed the voltage state to be different. So as far as the worm is concerned, it's the environment that reprogrammed it. So from the perspective of those cells, but fundamentally, this is how the body controls itself 24/7. So typically speaking, in the vast majority of cases where you're not being reprogrammed by a doctor, it is your cells that are reprogramming each other. They are all hacking each other through this interface. And this gives rise to the polycomputing framework that Josh Bongard and I came up with, which is this idea that in biology, at all scales, every subunit is hacking everything around it and also itself. Not hacking in the negative sense of trying to ruin it, hacking in Josh Tenenbaum's sense of the child as a hacker, meaning you don't know or care what the quote unquote correct way of using or interpreting something is. You will do it in whatever, you will use the affordances around you and also your own parts in whatever way is most adaptive. So the reason that organs have the shapes that they do, and that, in some animals they regenerate, and in all animals they persist over time despite cellular replacement, is precisely because the software is how the body controls itself. It can be hacked by us from quote unquote the environment, but this is naturally how this works all the time.
So let's go back to sort of the higher level of what makes us sort of thinking and sentient, and this notion of the self that you actually talk about. In a few places, you talk about the self as being sort of, if I remember correctly, something like a low-dimensional projection of some reality. But what does that mean at sort of an everyday level? Like, what does the self really mean in this situation where we are constantly changing, right, at a cellular level, and yet we're preserving quote-unquote memory, right? I mean, we change, but yet we preserve this thing. So whatever the mechanism is, whether you call it message passing or something else, there's something abstract that's being maintained as we move through life, right? So what does the self really mean here?
There are a number of ways to look at it. I'm one of the things I'm most sure about is that there should be no single definition of anything that we think is the sort of objective correct one. I think there are multiple useful ways to define these concepts that are useful in different contexts. But let's just talk about one. And I should say that What I'm not talking about right now, because my framework on this is not really ready yet, is I'm not talking about consciousness. So I'm not talking about the inner perspective of what it feels like to be a self. I'm not saying that's not important. I'm not saying consciousness doesn't exist. I'm not saying that there isn't a heart problem. I think all of these things are important, and I'm working on some things on that, but it's not ready. So I'm not going to say anything yet about consciousness. It's a really difficult field, but more functionally, what I think we can define selves in a couple of different ways. The first thing that defines a self is a cognitive light cone. It is the size and shape of the biggest goals you can possibly muster. And you can think about the size of the goals of a bacterium. A dog will have a bigger cognitive light cone, of course, but for example, a dog is never going to care about what happens 3 months from now in the next town. It just can't. That size, right? That cognitive system cannot maintain the size of that level of cognitive goal. Some humans are able to have goals that, they're working towards things that may or may not happen long after they're dead. They have these planetary scale, goals. So the human cognitive light cone is huge. So I think one thing that, one way to understand a self is as a continuously changing system with a defined cognitive light cone. And that system is constantly in the process of, another way to say it is it's in the process of sense making and storytelling. In our case, it's linguistic, but it doesn't have to be. I think very simple systems can have selves as well that are just not couched in terms of language. It's a continuously evolving model of the boundary of your cognitive light cone. So what you're trying to say is this is where I end and where the outside world begins. You are making models of that outside world. You are trying to estimate how much agency is in that outside world. You might want to know, am I learning or am I being trained? Who's on the other end of this interaction we're having? It's a continuously developing story that or model that you are trying to maintain and update and refine about what you are, what you care about, what your goals are, what your commitments are. It's also a commitment to certain perspectives. So any cognitive system has to choose, what am I going to pay attention to? How much am I going to coarse grain? Which states am I going to track? You can't track everything. It's impossible. So a self is a set of commitments to your perspective and to how you're going to process that information. And the degree of intelligence that you have to available to you to pursue those goals and to remap whatever memories you have in a way that makes sense now. And we're all familiar, even humans. I mean, we're not butterfly caterpillars, but even humans have the experience of having been children, having a set of perspectives and goals and preferences that change radically once the hormones start to remodel our brain, where you look back and you say, wow, I cared about that stuff, but that's irrelevant at this point. And then you have other memories, which may or may not be veridical, who knows? But your goal is to tell the best story you can at the current time. I think that's what is.
So, you mentioned consciousness, and I realize that consciousness is not down the middle of your plate, but it is related to what you're talking about, right? And at some point I remember reading something that you were talking about that maybe consciousness derives from or is related to a process of memory, actually, since memory is active as opposed to passive, maybe, making up stories and confabulation and things like that are all part of consciousness, right? That maybe they are actually even necessary conditions for consciousness. So say more about that.
Okay. So I'll say a couple things about consciousness. One way, I think, to think about consciousness is as what it feels like to be a being uncertain of their memories. The process of constantly, and of course, much of this is unconscious, ironically enough, because we don't have conscious effort in doing it. But being so Mark Solms says that consciousness is palpated uncertainty about the outside world. It's the feeling of having to make decisions to optimize for certain needs based on not actually knowing what's going to happen next. So very fundamental living thing kind of thing. I like it, and I extend that to the idea that not only are you not certain about the outside world, you're also not certain about yourself. you do not know out of the box at any given moment what the molecular structures in your body that encode these memories, what they mean. You can take a guess, but you actually don't know for sure. So the idea, the hard work of constantly trying to tell the best, the most reasonable story that preserves various psychological drives and, of course, various biological imperatives, that is, I think, a fundamental aspect of consciousness. And the other thing that...
So there's no uncertainty, there's no consciousness. So if you're always sure about something, that you don't even need to think about it, you just sort of apply a decision rule, that would not necessarily be consciousness.
I mean, to the extent that, I mean, I think what you just described, and I hate this word, but I think what you just described is what people have in mind when they use the word machine. When people say, well, that's not conscious, that's just a machine, I think what they have in mind is something that is algorithmic in the sense that it cranks through a set of steps where all the data and all the instructions are not under any kind of doubt, where everything is prescribed, everybody knows what everything means, and you just sort of roll along. I agree that I think that kind of thing is not the sort of substrate where you would expect to find consciousness, but I will put a weird twist on it, which is, and this relates to some work that we pre-printed some months ago, and the real paper is going to be out, I think, this week or in a couple of days. In the life sciences, there are two basic camps. One is the mechanists and one is the organicists. So the mechanists think, look, everything proceeds bottom up. All the important facts are to be found at the level of chemistry. They're not really reductionists because they don't want to talk about quantum foam, but they like chemistry. So not really reductionism, but for some reason they love chemistry. And the idea is that the best stories are told in the language of chemistry, and everything else proceeds from that. And we are all chemical machines, and that's all you get. The organicist camp says, look, the story of chemistry and the bottom-up rules does not capture everything there is of importance about the majesty of living things, because there are emergent, not just emergent unpredictability, not just emergent complexity, but actually emergent cognition and emergent inner perspective that is not captured by the rules of the hardware. Right, and then it's up to them to specify what that is, and that's really hard. But people work on it.
By the way, would this be related to sort of free will versus determinism?
It's related.
That is, the former would say we are.
It's related. Yeah, it's related. Although that's a slightly separate question where we would have to get into what work you expect the concept of free will to do, and we can talk about that. That's a slightly more it's an in-depth discussion. But the thing is that so here's the crazy claim that I'll make, and it probably will probably not sound good to you as a computer scientist, but I'll do it anyway. I think for the exact same reasons that the organicists find important aspects of living things that are not captured in the laws of chemistry, even though the laws of chemistry are not violated explicitly, for that same reason, they should be open to emergent, very basal, so incredibly small, but emergent basal cognition and possibly consciousness in algorithmic systems. Because, and the claim that I'll make is that algorithms are a formal model that does not capture everything there is to know about a system, even though you wrote the algorithm, you made it, the system is not violating the individual steps of the algorithm any more than living things violate chemistry. And yet, even extremely simple algorithms can do things that are not obvious from the algorithm. And the very simple example, if I can send you a copy of this paper if you haven't seen it, is we looked at sorting algorithms like bubble sort, selection sort, sorting algorithms. 6 lines of code, deterministic, transparent. People have been studying them for decades. People think they know what they do, and what do? They do exactly what the algorithm says they do. Turns out that if you actually, if you don't assume that that's the case, and you actually probe their behavior, if you pretend that they are agents navigating the space of possible ordered strings, you find some very interesting behavior. You find delayed gratification. You find the ability to navigate around errors. You find that they are actually optimizing something we found called clustering, which has nothing to do with what you said in the algorithm, and that extremely basal, simple thing, which is surprising and had never been seen before, you can already find at that level. So my point simply is that yes, consciousness by itself should not be associated with extremely determined systems where nothing is under question. However, even the things that look to us like they are algorithmic, I don't think are necessarily that at all. I think we have to be really careful not to confuse our formal models with the thing itself. And even already by the time you get to a 6-line sorting algorithm, you are already, I think, in the land where you have some emergent goal-directed intelligence that you did not anticipate.
So, Michael, one of the other sort of larger questions that your work made me think about was how much at odds the current paradigm of AI, like where we are with AI, is with the reality of biology. Biology really seems to matter, more than we might understand in intelligence. So what does this tell you about the future of AI and what's really needed to create sort of the next generation of intelligent machines? And you can think of this question also, I guess, from the standpoint of what are the current limitations of AI that you see? Where will it run into a wall, when it comes to intelligence?
Well, a few things. First of all, I think it's absolutely true that the current AI, even though systems that are supposed to be neuromorphic and stuff like that, are not at all the way that biology does things. Completely different. However, having said that, I don't think you can conclude from this that that it is not intelligence or that it's going to run into some particular wall. I do not believe in any kind of privileged substrate for intelligence. I don't think that blind evolution has any monopoly on creating minds. I don't think there's anything about the material substrate of biology that is critical here. I don't see any reason why we couldn't build intelligent beings out of completely other substrates. Now, having said that, again, I actually started writing a paper on, here are the, 5 or 6 ways in which current AI is not biological, and then I stopped, and I'm not going to write it. It's somebody else will, so it's not going to help anything. But I'm not going to be the one to do it, because it occurred to me that to whatever extent I'm right, and I could be completely wrong, but to whatever extent I'm right, it's going to lead to the creation of not just intelligent beings in the sense of performing well on problem-solving tasks, but actually beings with an inner perspective who matter in a moral sense. And I'm not interested in contributing to trillions of those that we can't control how they're going to be treated. So somebody else will do it. There's no way to stop it. But my point about AI is this: the current approach is absolutely not biological, but I don't think you can say from this that it isn't real, or that it isn't really intelligence, or that what it's doing. Somebody said to me a few months ago, this is somebody who was a significant figure in making these things, and he said, "Oh, these language models, there's nothing surprising going on there. I build them. I know what they do. I write this code. I build them." And I said, "You don't even know what bubble sort does. There's no way you can say that you know what these things do. Fine, you build them, but we already know that just because you build something doesn't mean that you understand what's really going on. And there needs to be a lot of humility around the idea that the biologists do not understand the biological substrate and where the consciousness of living things come from. We do not. We absolutely do not. Nor do the neuroscientists. And similarly, we do not understand the computational substrate enough to be able to say what it does and doesn't do. So I think we have to have a lot of humility about this. I don't think that certainly current language models and things like this, I do not believe they're anything like a biological mind. But that does not mean that there is no mind there, or that mind isn't going to crop up in a surprising place because we don't know what we're doing yet. And I think we have to be very open about these things, about the uncertainty of all of these things. And so, where is the limitation? I don't know. I think what's really interesting about and surprising about the advances of AIs over the last few years is how far it's dissociated linguistic problem solving from the typical biological history that always used to go with it. In the past, if something was talking to you, it was very obvious. You could say exactly where it came from, or you knew it had a biological history, and so on. We now have dissociated with that. And to what extent does real minds emerge under circumstances that are good for problem solving. We simply do not know. Anybody who says they're certain about what these AI models are doing, I think is wrong. Whether you built them or not, we actually do not know, because we do not understand the ingredients of basal cognition. It has nothing to do with the brain. It has nothing to do with imitating or failing to imitate the brain. Emergent cognition shows up in very surprising, very minimal places, and we just don't know.
This might be going into science fiction as we wrap up, but what do you see as sort of the future of AI, humans? Do you see hybrids, cyborgs, that kind of stuff emerging, like multiple different kinds of species?
Yeah. I've written on this quite a bit. I think that the distinction between I think the word machine and the distinction between machines and organisms is going to go in the dustbin of history. I think that we are all ultimately, assuming we live long enough, if all goes well, the mature species, I think, is going to have what I call freedom of embodiment, which is this idea that you don't just live your life in whatever body you happen to have been born into that was driven by the vagaries of evolution, the cosmic rays that did or did not hit some important DNA element or something else causing you to have limitations of health and IQ. Once we really understand what we're doing, which is basically the future of the regenerative medicine, deep regenerative medicine paradigm, everybody can have whatever embodiment they want. This means whatever sensory motor architectures, whatever combination of evolved material, design material, hybrids, cyborgs, chimeras of every kind, going to be surrounded by an incredible variety of creatures with diverse bodies and minds that go so far beyond, Darwin's phrase of endless forms, most beautiful. That all of the variety of nature is a tiny dot in this option space of what's open to us, and that's what I see for the future.
Michael, I don't know where the hour went, or hour plus went. The time's gone. But part of me feels like we barely scratched the surface. There's so many places where I could have gone down and for another 10 or 20 minutes. But I'm just going to reflect on what we've talked about and, think about a follow-up conversation to this, because the space is just so much deeper and richer than people realize. But I really want to thank you for your time, and sharing your thinking with us. Really enjoyed the conversation. Enjoyed reading your work. Fascinating.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm happy to come back again. I think your audience and especially people who work on in computing and information technology really need to understand what's going on in biology, and the opportunities for the future are and for a better future are incredible. So thank you.
Indeed. Yeah, no, I'm realizing that increasingly. Well, thanks again, Michael, and we'll be in touch.
Cool. Thanks very much.